Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will note parenthetically that I would reserve the right to come back to you to argue more substantively on the question of the rights of smaller parties in relation to report stage. It is very clear, though, as you have outlined, that in this case there had been no direction from the committee to afford an opportunity, one that I would either welcome or resist, to appear before committee, as opposed to having this opportunity. And in our system, our parliamentary democracy, it is a very fundamental principle that all members of Parliament are equal, and that it is our job here, as to our abilities and our efforts, to equally contribute to the passage of legislation. Now, to this particular matter, Bill C-7, we have before us important legislation to create for the first time the ability of RCMP officers to collectively bargain with their employer forms of basically to unionize the workforce, to have an opportunity to work together as employer and employee to set out how that working relationship goes forward, and to give the RCMP officers rights collectively to bargain. Now, this should not really just rely on legislation. If we go back to the BC Hospitals case, the Supreme Court of Canada was very clear on this matter, that all workers have the right to collectively bargain, whether they're in a position to form a union or not. And in fact, in the BC Hospitals case, it's made very clear that labour rights are human rights. So why do I bring forward this very critical amendment? And I am hoping that members of Parliament from all sides of this House will give my amendment serious consideration to improve this legislation. The amendments, which are essentially sub-deletions within a section, therefore they're considered substantive amendments, and only a member of Parliament in a party with fewer than 12 MPs at this stage in our proceedings is in a position to put forward this amendment. So I would hope that many members of Parliament from other parties will actually be grateful that we've got this one opportunity to improve the legislation substantively before passage. Here's the problem with the sections that my amendments delete. They preempt the collective bargaining process to say that the collective agreement cannot include conditions relating to, quote, conduct, comma, including harassment, comma, close quote. That's all I'm attempting to do, is to remove that line. Remove the preemptive legislative act of taking out of the hands of collective bargaining the opportunity to ensure that the collective agreement between RCMP officers and their employer have the possibility of provisions to protect the workers from harassment. Now, I just want to stress again that by passing this amendment, it does not insist upon the inclusion in a collective agreement of steps to protect workers from harassment. It only leaves that opportunity open to them through the process of collective agreements. Now, I'm actually baffled that we're even having this conversation in 2016 about the rights of RCMP officers to collectively bargain to protect themselves from harassment. The number of complaints that make their way into public media are fewer than the ones that actually occur. I'm in touch with several RCMP officers who have filed complaints against their superior officers or their colleagues for sexual harassment, but their cases are still private, and I will not mention their names, but I will mention the names of women who have been sexually harassed within the RCMP and have come forward. It's certainly not news to any member of this place that we have an unacceptable degree of sexual harassment within the RCMP, that far too many fine, well-trained, exemplary officers find themselves unable to work in a toxic workplace, file a grievance for sexual harassment, and then find themselves completely alone, often having to go to their doctor who says, look, you're basically dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. You can't go back into that workplace. Here's a note for sick leave. So officers who could be contributing to putting people behind bars, to helping to take evidence, to helping to put a case together, they're home on sick leave while their harassers are at work. There needs to be some rebalancing here. I refer to the case which recently was actually settled out of court, of Corporal Catherine Galliford. And she actually had to go to court in launching, so it wasn't an internal RCMP sexual harassment complaint. She actually went to court after years of sexual harassment. And what she said was, quote, "What broke me is that I had no one to go to for help," close quote. That's what struck me when I was dealing privately with some of the RCMP officers currently in harassment complaints that are internal. I hadn't realized how grim it is for women within the RCMP when they file a complaint for against sexual harassment. They have no access to a union rep to help them through the process. They have no help getting a lawyer to protect them and their rights through the process. They are isolated and essentially harassed all over again because they also are shunned by other members of the force because they filed a complaint of sexual harassment. Surely to God, when this place has dealt with issues of sexual harassment for how we handle it within Parliament, when we're looking at issues of sexual harassment on university campuses, we're looking at an unacceptable acceptance of misogyny and sexism in various places throughout our society. When we have the chance to make one small amendment to Bill C-7 to create the possibility that this new collective agreement covering RCMP officers will give them the right, male or female, to have a mechanism to deal with inappropriate conduct within the force. I don't need to remind members of the recent evidence. Actually, RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson spoke to it recently that, yes, he really doesn't need to have it pointed out to him that it's unacceptable to have RCMP officers wandering around naked at the office. But conduct provisions in a collective agreement should be open to employer and employee to negotiate what level of accepted conduct they can stand, what levels of support a victim of harassment, male or female, needs to conduct themselves and continue to do their job. So, Mr. Speaker, given extraordinary degrees of public awareness of the problem that women in the RCMP face, given the unacceptable conduct towards, it's a minority of the cases, but they're there, of men who are mistreated within the RCMP, given that we know that the RCMP is one of the finest police agencies on the planet, that we want to support the RCMP going forward to clean up what many members of the force have referred to as an unacceptable culture, an abusive culture, then this is one mechanism. And why would we as lawmakers preempt collective bargaining to say you can negotiate many things? And as you can see from my amendment, there's no attempt here to remove the specific terms or conditions that shouldn't go into a collective agreement related to policing. So the provisions that will be left in place cover the collective agreements shall not touch on law enforcement techniques or transfers from one position to another or appraisals or probation or anything related to carrying out their duties qua RCMP officer. Anything related to what they must do as an RCMP officer cannot be in a collective agreement. I understand why lawmakers make that stand. But why would we in Bill C-7 remove the possibility of a proper regime to assist any member of the force who needs the support of their union, a lawyer, a counselor, whatever provisions can be worked into a collective agreement through free, unfettered collective bargaining? Why would we close the door on their access to collective agreements that include rules, guidelines, and a framework to deal with harassment? Mr. Speaker, I know I have less than a minute left. I just want to focus the House's attention on the fact that this is one single amendment, one amendment. It is not an attempt to slow down the passage of this bill. It is not vexatious. It is an attempt using the democracy that exists through the Westminster parliamentary system that allows any member of Parliament to improve legislation, really improve it at report stage by inviting all my colleagues, whether they were on the committee at clause by clause or not, to look at this bill afresh and say, let's improve it. Let's make sure that this House speaks with one voice to support every woman in the RCMP who's ever been harassed, to say we end an abusive culture here by giving you real rights in collective bargaining to improve the conduct of the RCMP and end sexism within the RCMP. end an abusive culture once and for all. Thank you.